This is a production of Cornell University.
Okay, well, Brian Schlesinger and my friends at Bryant Park, now that the ice rink is off of there in Manhattan, the site is regraded, and the staff decided to go out and mow a big heart. So we're really rooting for all our friends and loved ones in the metropolitan New York area. And Karl, I know a very old an alumni of yours at UConn, Stephanie, runs the Madison Square Park down there as well. And we're all of those people are on our minds these days at the epicenter. So we're happy to be able to lay this down on videotape, and as well for those of you that can join us live, and hopefully you've got some questions. You know, it's hard to, reconcile many things as they pass through our minds these days, media and other things that are there. We've been through, as a species, some crisis in the past that we have some recent memory of. And when we have leaders who call upon us to do certain things, which maybe doesn't include injecting Lysol into our veins. I couldn't help myself, Karl. I had to do it this morning. So good to see you all. Anyway, there are still resources that are out there available to you that our cooperative extension people do. Not to dwell on this too much, but it continues to be updated. The government is, now in a phase where the numbers are doing certain things that they're not. We're not getting these sort of big shifts in the things we're doing. There's still quite a bit of confusion about the way things are going on. But in general, I would say landscape and lawn care and grounds are working, maybe not to the degree that they'd like to be all the time. One of the things that's important in our industry is that we do work with, we interact with the public. I mean, golf courses can stay away from people to a certain extent because organized sports aren't going on. Sports can stay away from people. If you're in the grounds area and your university or facility is currently not open, obviously that social distancing becomes a little bit easier. But I can tell you from recent trips to the grocery store, not everybody's getting this social distancing thing. And especially that we're in employment and working and out in the public, we've got specific guidance in New York State for the way we want to handle that. All right, let's look at the weather we've been going through for the last several weeks. Rather than just go through all the slides of temperature, I can tell you that we were warming up for a period of time during the season and now have hit a stall. I think one of the things I've realized from chatting with people in all aspects of turf is, I've got to stop myself from doing the things I normally do at this time, especially if your system is normally getting traffic like it does in golf and sports, where you're using nutrients to sort of keep up with the wear and tear. But in the lawn and grounds area where traffic either may or may not be greater or lesser, you should be able to moderate some of your nutrient management, some of your weed control, some of your other practices to address the fact that the growing season is not really progressing. It did, and then for the last several weeks it stopped. And we were joking yesterday with our weather person, Art DiGaetano. I think it snowed more in April up here in upstate New York than it snowed all of the winter. Get the next slide. And here is the growing degree day forecast for the coming week. Now, over the last 2 weeks, we've had basically single-digit accumulations, and we don't expect much more than 15 degrees to accumulate. We've had very few days in much of the Northeast where average temperature has been above 50 degrees. And so when that happens, you're not accumulating. Now, how does that translate? Well, in one way it translates, especially in the lawn and grounds area where weeds are going to be a big component of your services. We have models that we've adapted that were used and developed in the Midwest and validated across much of the northern United States to indicate that when you get about 150 base 50 growing degree days accumulated from March 1st, you at about 150 to 200, you start to become a favorable time to apply post-emergent broadleaf weed control with 2,4-D. And that was a model designed for dandelions and 2,4-D use for control. And so if you just use that as a barometer for when many of your perennials might be susceptible in the spring to an herbicide application, and you've got reduced staff, and you just can't, do your normal apps the way you did. Timing those applications is going to be even more critical. Now, the ester formulation of 2,4-D, which we recommend for dandelion control early, right? We don't recommend it when it gets warmer because ester formulations have a bad habit of volatilizing. These formulations are one of the primary causes of landscape plant, vegetable plant damage early in the spring, is the application of these products when young plants or emerging spring growth is happening in the landscape. You apply this, it gets really warm, like 80 degrees, and all of a sudden the chemicals will volatilize, move with the and drift as a vapor and injure nearby plants. This is one of the most common injuries that we see in the landscape that we'll probably talk about next week as we bring a weed scientist back in. But just a note that right now it's way too early, even in the metropolitan New York area. It's way too early to be applying many of these broadleaf weed controls post-emergence. All right, now from a growth and fertilizer perspective, we've really grown accustomed to using this growth potential. How much can the grass possibly grow? And I know Karl's done a lot of in-depth research in, the pool of nitrogen in the soil and the quality of the turf, and is there a way we can calibrate these things? And where we know that the soil is that part of the puzzle we don't understand completely yet, whether it's microbial activity and mineralization of nitrogen, soil nitrate pool, those sorts of things are still under research. But we have some guides that in general, if photosynthetic activity maxes out in the mid 60s, as you can see again on this chart, if it maxes out here in the mid to upper 60s, right? And you're only averaging 50 degrees temperature, you only got about 25% chance to grow. You're not going to be able to grow very much, which means that, you're not going to respond to fertilizer very much, which brings us to the conversation for today with my longtime colleague and pal, Karl Guillard. Karl, when you did this, I'm going to go through a couple of slides and then I'll get to some questions along the way. But I want to make sure everybody understands this is online and available, the New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission. And what I've liked about this, and I think Marty participated in it as well, Marty Petrovic, the emeritus professor here at Cornell University, participated in this and was able to, get recommendations out there that were based around one of the ecosystem services of turf, that it's really going to be useful, especially in urban environments, for keeping the water clean. And so the way they approached it is pretty classic. It was done with focus groups and industry participation. So what I like about it is it seems cooperative. It's the kind of thing that if it moves to regulation looks like it's going to be well informed. So how are they approaching it? Well, it's the 5 R's, right? Everybody knows these top 4, but as they write in the narrative of this, if you take a minute to look at it, that last one, that's, what are the right things that support these actions and support the turf's ecosystem services, the supporting services that urban grasslands provide by retaining stormwater and nutrients. Now, let's start with a few of these that are pretty obvious and we're talking about with our current weather conditions, and then we'll get to the questions in a minute. But right now, one of the guidelines is around right time. There's right product, there's right rate, right formulation, there's right rate. There's a number of things in here. I'm going to highlight a few. One is we're expecting a pretty good wet washout over the next several days. Our weather forecast is indicating as much as 2 to 3 inches in some locations. And the least amount of rain anyone's going to get in the Northeast is about an inch over the next 5 to 7 days. So if you look at guideline 18 and 19, now ain't the right time, folks, and so to speak, in New York language, if you will. It's not the right time to be putting down fertilizer because we're we're likely to get a fair amount of water, and we could get some help with this if we could continue to get manufacturers to put these kinds of notes. The regional guideline number 20 highlights do not apply near water storm drains, such and such. Okay, what about the right place? Now, this is what's very interesting. Because we're going to be really wet, the soils are going to be already saturated. I almost feel like the entire urban environment to some extent is a urban turf to some extent is a sensitive area because it's so much associated with the pavement. Now, if you look at the right place, I'm sorry, environmentally sensitive areas, and it's the amount of nitrogen that you put down. So if you have a sensitive area, the guidelines say no more than a half a pound of N per thousand per application, and 3/4 of a pound in a single application, which means the other 0.2 has to be slow release nitrogen. Then they're also saying that in these sensitive areas, you shouldn't put on more than 2 pounds total. Now, that's very much in line what we've said last year when the nitrogen regulations came up, and we were saying, well, what's a justifiable rate of nitrogen? And you're thinking about Long Island being a sensitive location, especially for nitrogen. These are very much in line with what we've been promoting to the legislators should they be considering some form of regulation. Now, what about right supporting actions in here? Roughly, it's saying mow high, leave the clippings. If you can't leave the clippings, don't let them be on paved surfaces. How many times have you heard us say this and write this? And this is one of the characteristic problems we have of urban grasslands. By definition, they're butted up against some sort of pavement. So mow high, leave the clippings. If you can't, make sure they're not going into the stormwater. And then finally, some of the right supporting actions that address the compost discussion we had last week. Number one, organic materials should be tested. If you're going to try to fix your soil, you should know what you're doing and be very careful because phosphorus is a big issue. If you're using biosolids, we certainly want you to know what you're doing. And it looks like it should be trace amounts, I think was the term we mentioned last time. If it has phosphate above trace amounts, because if you start putting 1/4 and 1/2 inch of it on, even with trace amounts, it winds up being a lot of phosphorus. So Karl, this is where I'll bring you back in here, pal, for our conversation today. Thanks for taking the time. I want to start, maybe the place to go at is, do you agree a little bit with my assessment of these areas being in urban areas when the soils are saturated, being sensitive sites that we should maybe observe the sensitive site part of this guideline?
Oh, yeah, I think you're absolutely right with that area. I mean, when we look at our urban areas, and one of my former colleagues at UConn, Jack Clausen, he always told me, when you're looking at water quality, follow the water. So in any urban areas, we're going to have a lot of impervious surfaces and areas where water is just going to, particularly the runoff water, is going to be channeled directly into receiving waters. So I think anything that we can do to prevent any potential contamination coming from, as you'd mentioned, either clippings and certainly if fertilizers, and that includes both the synthetic and the organics, is that all that can move. So if we can direct those and as the whole, I agree with the whole concept of this document in terms of the 4 or the 5 R's on doing that. I guess the challenge of doing that, we can say all that we want, but actually putting it into practice. And I think that's where the challenge is, particularly for a lot of the professional folks that are doing this. And oftentimes it may have to be that each property may be slightly adjusted in terms of almost well, it would be. Ideally, it should be site specific.
Right.
And how to dial in, and changing from property to property to property.
Right. So let's start with some easy stuff. Let's start with some easy questions. First off, what I don't see, I think it's mentioned in there a couple of times, but one of the things that we start out with that makes it really easy for people to understand is if you have an older lawn that's had grass on it for a while, inherently it should need less nutrients across the board. So if you're trying to be site specific and you think, well, how the heck do I do that? I like to tell people, just start with how old the lawn is. If it's young, it might need some more help. But if it's older, it's going to have that reservoir in the organic matter that it supplies that it's going to be able to draw on. Can you talk about that for a little bit, Karl? Is that a good first cut with how to determine how much to fertilize just age of the lawn?
Sure. I think the work from your institute long ago. Yeah, I think it was Porter in the early 80s or late 70s.
72.
Yeah, okay. Well, indicated, and I think their data and their modeling showed as you get a lawn that's about 10 years old, then that increase in the soil organic matter and the nitrogen is going to be pretty much equalized or equilibrated at that point. So some of the recommendations that we've had is as you get into a mature lawn, and let's say let's pick a benchmark point, at 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
As you're approaching 10 years and beyond, you should be able to reduce the nitrogen input into that, because if you then start to exceed that, it's not going to have the capacity to absorb. We don't have finite capacity of holding on and retaining that nitrogen. We're going to get to some equilibrium through that. So I think, and also you'd mentioned about returning clippings. So this whole concept of older lawns, returning clippings on there, and I would suggest, or I would guess, that many of these areas that have been receiving, say, historical rates of X number of pounds of nitrogen per year, I bet you in those, if they were cut down by a third or a half, I doubt if there would be much difference in terms of the visual quality or performance on those.
Okay, so that's perfect. That's the exact answer. And if you have an older lawn and you start to reduce your fertilizer, it's unlikely you're going to notice. And we've heard this when we started our potassium research many years ago. People were throwing potassium like crazy. And we were like, what are you doing? And then people would stop applying, especially in the golf space. They'd stop applying it, and then they wouldn't say it publicly. They'd come to me in the site. They say, I haven't applied potassium in like 5 years, and I barely noticed it. So,
right, I haven't
so that's the first thing. But let's hone in on the spring here, because now, at the jump, everybody wants weed and feed, especially in the lawn and grounds market, and large landscapes and production-oriented operations, much like lawn and grounds are different than sports and golf. They're very production oriented. They're very, here's what we do when we cover our 3,000 lawns, or we take care of our 10 properties, and here's the way we do it. We deploy them, and it's a matter of how fast the truck can get there, do their due diligence, and get out. And I'm not suggesting there's anything wrong with that. But I'm wondering now, if this COVID situation, reduced staff, having to send out all the trucks, not wanting so much growth, how would you approach what you know about nitrogen use in the spring under these conditions?
Yeah, well, one other aspect too about nitrogen uptake in grass is oftentimes we tend to forget is that it has to come through, there has to be water moving through the plant. And I know I've spent a lot of time, and I know we're in the spring here, but I've spent a lot of work kind of dialing in with fall fertilization. And the work that you were involved with on the paper that Doug Soldat put out, I think it was last year.
Yeah, at the International, yep.
Yeah, just excellent papers looking at nitrogen uptake in plants with temperature and ET. And so it was those papers and that research, and I've got data on that too from past research, basically shows that as it gets colder, you're going to have less and less uptake of that. But we haven't necessarily taken that information and moved it to the spring as well. The physics don't change.
Okay. But how come, a couple of weeks ago, we had Doug Soldat. He actually may be on here right now. We had him on, and I've always sort of, why is the grass starting to grow early? Where is it getting the nitrogen? It's been cold, it's been wet, and it still greens up and starts to grow in some places. So it can't just be water movement.
No. Well, I am absolutely convinced with that, and I think we've got some data that will be coming out soon to show that plants, the grasses and the green up on that is due largely to the stored nitrogen from the previous fall. So I think from an agronomic standpoint, where the fall fertilization concept, it does work agronomically. The plant, there needs to be a certain amount of mass of nitrogen that the plant accumulates out, and then it's going to utilize that, and especially for the spring green up. And I know if anybody who's been involved in managing with grass, it's almost like somebody flips a switch sometime in the spring, then all of a sudden it just greens up. But from a water movement and uptake. It can't be coming primarily from water uptake. It has to come from, I believe, that what's been stored within the plant. And so we're using that concept and that hypothesis to look at that nitrogen within the plant at that time and how it's going to affect plant growth and development. And then how can we use that information to help us guide our nitrogen rates from that. So that's some work we've got on, and that'll be coming out shortly. But up until we have some actual true objective measurements on there, let's face it, we're just guessing. Sometimes we guess right, and I would suspect a lot of times we guess wrong. And if you guess wrong in terms of putting more on than you need, you're not going to see changes from the plant visually. You know, from an agronomic standpoint, that's fine. The plant, it's not necessarily going to hurt the plant. But from a water quality standpoint, yeah, we're going to have conflicting goals relative to environmental goals and agronomic goals.
Now, exactly right. Now, I know you spent a lot of time researching this, and one of the measures you use is color. Everybody wants their grass to green up. And if you looked at what, you know, people complain about in the spring, it's weeds and why isn't my lawn as green as the neighbors and greening up. And so is using color a good way to determine when to put on nitrogen?
No. Yes, with a caveat, in that assuming all other factors that affect color have been controlled for. And so,
such as temperature?
Yeah, sure. Well, you have insects, temperatures, water, all those can absolutely affect, but assuming that those have either been controlled for or are optimum or within the range of acceptable, then certainly color. Now, let's face it, we have been using color, and turfgrass managers have been using color to guide their management forever. You know, you ask many long-term managers, and they have a really good intuitive sense. They'll look at the grass and say, well, I got to put a little bit on. I'm not going to put anything on. And what are they basically doing? They're using their visual color and experience to do that.
Do you find that when they do that, do they oftentimes over-fertilize?
Well, I think they can. I mean, the human eye is good. The human eye, and I think the data that Richardson and Karcher put out, I think the human eye is pretty good at detecting differences that are pretty disparate apart. Mm-hmm. You get closer and closer and closer, human eye is not good for detecting out very, very slight differences, where in many times in turf cases can make a big difference between optimum amount and excess or above optimum.
Okay, I want to shift gears just for a second and talk a little bit about compost, because we've had this recurring theme, and we think, especially in the lawn and grounds market, physical properties of soils are big problems. And obviously, one of the solutions to that is the incorporation and regular use of compost. Now, we hear that mantra, and you've heard it and you addressed it in this publication. And I have to say, in most cases, you basically were saying, if you're going to use this thing, this is a problem. You better be really careful about the way you use it and how you use it. And so we've seen some work trying to use sources of compost that are not so laden with phosphorus. Mm-hmm. How do you talk to people about trying to fix soil physical properties, Karl? And you know, Soldat says just build another soil on top of it. Unless you're going to till the grass, you know, the compost in, it's going to be hard to fix. And I think he's right about that. Where are you on this use of compost in the lawn and ground space?
Yeah, well, I'm not necessarily against it. And certainly, you know, compost is very good for remediating out certain aspects. But it's not necessarily benign to the environment. You know, just because it comes from organic sources and such on that, it doesn't mean that you can continually load that on. And especially in established turf systems, you're going to get stratification and layers upon layers, higher and higher. And I think some of the data, especially with the phosphorus, even though it may be low phosphorus, as you had mentioned before, some of the compost rates that are putting on there, low concentration, but at high rates, you know, sometimes meets those critical environmental levels. And where you have higher concentrations up near the surface, that's going to be more amenable to moving off with surface water, especially this time of the year on frozen soil.
That's right.
And stuff with that. So the big challenge, of course, is how do we guide this? Now, recently, my student David Moore and I put out and my colleague Tom Morris have put out a series of papers recently where this is what we're trying to look at. Can we utilize some sort of these new biological soil tests to look at the carbon dioxide rates coming out of soils or some certain fractions of nitrogen coming out to help guide that? And
right.
Some of our data suggests that, yeah, we could take, and especially I think for folks that are managing and utilizing compost, these tests may have really good promise on helping guide that.
So it definitely begins with you. If you're going to use compost, it definitely begins with you testing it. And Karl, as we wrap up, I want to just draw our attention to this again. A fertilization program in that publication that's basically saying if you fertilize twice a year, it's saying late April to early May, less than 0.7 of a pound. Most of the nitrogen should be slow release. So, 3 times still keeps us under the 2 pounds. But a lot of people, as you see here, are basically just saying what you're showing in the New England climate in the Northeast. Once a year in sensitive sites, just to maintain that turf density, is going to be really critical. So you still like this chart, right, Karl, for guiding the way the landscape and grounds people should be feeding?
I based on what we have to help us guide, especially for rates, I think this is reasonable. I think it's reasonable. Of course, I think the weakness with everything we do is that we really don't know what the correct rate is. We're making assumptions. It's like 0.9, 0.5, 0.7. To me, these are still all arbitrary. You could take that. I'm following this guide. I'm doing it very well. But if you have a soil that has really high mineralization capacity, say years and years of compost applications, returning your clippings, and you start putting down these rates on here, let's not think that we're still going to protect water quality by doing that. Yes, I think we need some sort of guidance to start out with. But also, I think we need common sense to help us guide that and not necessarily blind, well, I followed this recommendation that you said and you put out, therefore I am doing everything environmentally responsibly. Please let's take some personal responsibility with this as well.
Okay, that's right.
Yeah,
that's so great, Karl. This is so great. Let me ask if there's questions.
I know it's really hard for and I've had people where I've given talks and some of the lawn care companies that have hundreds, if not thousands of customers that's saying, I hear what you're saying and I agree with it. But how can we do this individually for each practice? For them, time is money. And it's most efficient to calibrate everything to give a uniform rate distribution.
And go.
Set and go. And so, yeah, but also we've got to use some common sense on doing this too. Now hopefully coming up soon with the technologies that's being developed and with big data and the sensors and drones and things like that, I think we're going to be able to get a lot of data coming in, and then also the work that Doug Soldat and you folks did at Cornell with the temperature and ET. I think we should be able to model that stuff very, very.
Yeah, and that's of course, that's of course Marty's work that he was kind enough to, Marty and Doug's work that they were kind enough to share with me. I was a ride along on that. So let's ask if there's any questions, Karl. Are there any questions there, Karl?
Yep. So we got one from Kathy. A good question. We were talking earlier about people putting down nitrogen really to get the color, and she's asking if additional iron can improve the color of the grass as an alternative to nitrogen.
How do you like iron, Karl, for color rather than nitrogen?
Well, sure, it can work as a substitute, and I think it would be, especially where you have sufficient or optimum amounts of mineralizable or available nitrogen in there, sure, absolutely. You could cut back and put a little bit of iron on there. And from a visual standpoint, there's nothing wrong with it.
Liquid.
Yeah.
Liquid.
Yeah. Usually it's a foliar
but not granular, because it's not soil uptake necessarily.
No. That probably, and depending on some of your soil chemistry too, putting on iron in the soil is, it's not. We typically have enough iron already in most of our New England soils.
Yeah.
We're not deficient in iron. Let's put it that way.
And so really, you're just painting the grass with iron.
Sure. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
If it helps you cut down on some environmental.
Well, at this stage of the game, here's what it helps me with. I got less guys, and I can't mow as much, and
Sure.
I'd like it to be green, but I don't want it to grow. Why don't I go squirt some iron?
Yeah. Well, you could do that, but again, it's all a cost benefit relationship on that. They don't give away that stuff.
That's right.
That's
right. Speaking of not giving away, Karl, we're getting past the witching hour. Any questions?
I do want to get to this question from Rich. He's saying that they customize fertilization programs based on the soil test, and they apply based on the results. Do you guys have any comments on soil testing and maybe any values or certain methods of guidelines that you would go by based on soil test results?
Yeah. Well,
so this would be other than nitrogen.
Yes, other than nitrogen.
Other than nitrogen.
Well, I was going to address the nitrogen part of that, because you are guiding your fertilization based on some soil test that you get back from either a government lab, a state lab, university lab, or any private labs, that you are guiding your nitrogen fertilization from a soil test from any of those labs. I can tell you right now, they're not based on any calibration data on there. And there are only 2 calibration data in the literature. One came out of my lab and one came out of Michigan State from Paul Ricci many years ago. They didn't find any relationship to soil nitrogen and turf response. We did, but we had to sample every week or 2 weeks throughout the year. And then, yeah, there's a relationship. But if you're just sending in a soil sample, getting that back for nitrogen, it's not going to work for nitrogen. For phosphorus, and absolutely. Soil tests for phosphorus are very good. Guide your fertilization based on there. You should be doing that. The other nutrients, the relationships and calibrations are also fairly decent for turf, maybe except for potassium.
Still got to dial that one down. All right, Karl C., any other questions before we're out of here?
Just one more, and I was actually talking with Doug Soldat a couple of weeks ago about this one. Edward's asking, snow can capture atmospheric nitrogen. A lot of people refer to snow as like a slow release fertilizer in the spring. Is that a reason for earlier green up? Do we have any research out there that's been done on snow containing any trace amounts of nitrogen?
That's a good question, and I don't know, but I know some of the older folks and some of the farmers in my earlier career, what I used to work with, they called early spring snow poor man's fertilizer. I suspect, with our atmospheric deposition, and there could be some nitrogen coming down in there, and maybe it's getting foliar absorbed. I don't know. That's an interesting question. Is there's a possibility of that? Sure. But, of course, we can't rely on that all the time. But if we do get that, maybe dial back your nitrogen a little bit on there.
Perfect.
All right. I think that's a good place to end, Frank.
Thank you so much, Karl, for joining us. It's great to see you. You be safe and well, huh?
You too. All right.
Look forward to seeing you soon.
You.
Bye, everyone.
Okay, bye, everybody.
Thanks, Karl.
See you, Karl.
Thanks, Karl
Thank
C.
you.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.